Hey kids, so we've been learning about some in-game stuff, in-game techniques, and this one we're going to start a series that's going to be familiar to some of you, but it might be new to others, and we want to get to some of the principle behind it. We're going to be looking at the knight and bishop checkmate, but like I said, we want to do more than just learn the checkmate. We want to understand it a little bit. So what I really recommend is that you have a chessboard out so that you can play along and not just watch me do it, but get used to moving the pieces yourself with this. So if you have a chessboard, go grab it real quick. Don't worry, I'll sit here and wait. Okay, I'm kidding, I'm not going to wait. But you can pause your video and go get a chessboard, and then you can unpause it once you have it and set it up, kind of like what you see I have on my board right here. Okay, so hopefully you have paused your video, you have grabbed your chessboard, and you are ready to go. Okay, so the knight and bishop checkmate. It is a checkmate that not very many people bother learning because it happens so rarely in a game. In all my years of playing chess, I may have seen it been a factor maybe once or twice ever. So why bother spending time learning this complicated checkmate if it doesn't show up in a game? Well, when I learned this checkmate, one of the things I noticed was I learned a lot about how knights and bishops work together and how they coordinate. And so while I haven't had to use my knight and bishops to give a checkmate, I can tell you I have done some major damage to my opponents because I know better how to use my knights and bishops. And so it's just good for understanding the knights and bishops. So we are going to look at the checkmate, but one of the things I want to show you first is I want to show you kind of how the two pieces coordinate. Notice if the knight and the bishop are right next to each other, they both attack this square right here, right? The knight also attacks this, and the bishop attacks along these diagonals. There's a lot of light squared control right around them, right? All these squares are taken up. But what if I put the bishop 2 squares away? Okay, well now the knight still has these squares, but look at this barrier created right around that knight. It is really hard to get to that knight, isn't it? So they can coordinate really well when they're 2 squares away from each other. Now if they're 3 squares away, this is interesting. Notice the knight and the bishop both hit the same squares. The bishop hits all the squares the knight hits. This is a really good way to control your opponent's knight. If your opponent has a knight on the edge of the board and you have a bishop, putting that bishop 3 squares away controls all the squares the knight can move to. Okay? And so now the knight's pretty much useless from that distance. And so we're going to see as we learn the knight and bishop checkmate, one of the really common patterns to look for is getting your knight and bishop 2 squares away. So they're controlling different color squares, but it creates a barrier. I put them on the wrong spot. Let me swap these real quick. It creates a barrier that the king can't get through. Look at the bishop's squares. And now look at the knight squares. There is a continuous wall here that king is completely trapped inside. And you're able to bring your own king up and close down that space and make it even tighter. See, the king can't get to the bishop because of the knight, and the king can't get to the knight because of the bishop. Alright, so let's take a look now at the checkmate itself. Okay. So generally what you want to get to is a position like this, where your king and your bishop are working together to box in your opponent's king. See how the bishop takes off the diagonal and the king cuts off the escape. So this king is stuck, just moving back and forth between these 2 squares, right? He can only move back and forth. So while the king is moving back and forth, you can get your knight ready and your bishop ready. So when the king is in the corner here, if the knight is ready to jump into the corner square opposed to it, then you can check with the bishop. Notice now that we are controlling all of these squares. The king has to move to here, and the knight jumps in and delivers checkmate. All right, so that's what we're looking for, is a checkmate that looks like this. It starts with the bishop and the king closed in around this king, and the knight jumping in. So let's back up a little bit and see how we get there from a different position. Okay, so take a look at this position. Notice this is what we had set up on the previous board. We have the bishop cutting off these squares, and the knight filling in the gaps. Right? So that knight and bishop, 2 squares away, they cover a lot of space. And so now the king has to move away. The king can try to come towards the pieces, or it can step over to f8. So we've got go to f8 or f7. Let's say it's going to f7. Oh, sorry, it can't go to f7. I made a mistake there because the knight, oh, that's right, the knight is blocking that square. So it has to go to f8. So it goes to f8. And so to tighten this space in, you move your king up. Now notice the king has taken away a new square. All right, so the king has to step in closer. All right, and your king steps up again. And now the king is covering these squares, the bishop's covering this square, and the knight is covering this square. Okay, so the king has to go somewhere. If the king goes up, this is your chance to maneuver your bishop over to the f8 square. That's its target, right? So the bishop comes here. Now take a look at which squares we're blocking. The king is blocking these two, the bishop's blocking this one, the knight's blocking this one, but uh-oh, it looks like the king can get out. So the king can step towards the bishop, but then you reroute the bishop over here. Now the bishop is covering these 2 squares, the king is covering these squares, and the knight's covering that square. And now we have a tighter box. Okay? If the king steps up, move your king in, and you've got the position we needed, right? Now we're just waiting on maneuvering our knight around and getting ready for checkmate. If the king instead goes towards the bishop, well, you can go ahead and, since the king is not close to this square any longer, the knight can start his moves over to g4, right? So directly across from the king and ready to jump into this square. All right, so now let's look at what we're blocking off now. Right now we're blocking off these squares. The king looks like it has a way out, but the king has to step over here, which gives our king time to step up. The king is blocking these squares. The bishop is blocking these squares. The king has to step back, check, and checkmate. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to set your board up just like this, okay? And I want you to see, maybe you can get some little coins or pennies or something like that. This might help actually. Get some pennies or some little Lego pieces or something you can put on your chessboard. And I want you to mark every square that the bishop is blocking, every square the knight is blocking, and every square the king is blocking, so that you can see, okay, here is my barrier, right? Then you make a move for black and move your king and mark your new barrier, okay? And keep doing this and play through all the way until you keep that king trapped every single move. There's our new barrier, keeping the king trapped every move. And this one ended up a little differently. The king was actually on h7, so it's really important in this position to check with the knight and deliver checkmate with the bishop. But by using those pennies or Legos or whatever you put on the board, you can see exactly how well your knight and your bishop are coordinated and how you keep controlling the king and get it tighter and tighter and tighter. So, excuse me. So obviously we started from a really nice position, right? We already had the king trapped. Well, that's why this is not the only video in this series, because it's important to know how to get checkmate from this position, but it's also important to know how to get to this position. And so that's what we're going to cover in a later video. But for now, practice with this. Make sure you feel really comfortable starting from this position and getting all the way to checkmate. All right, I hope you learned something. I hope you can appreciate how the knights and bishops work together. 2 spaces away, they control opposite squares. 3 spaces away, they control each other. All right, so get some practice with that. Work some puzzles on Chess Kid and get ready for the tournament. See you next time.